There are disasters that do not arrive with a bang. There is no moment when the sky splits open, no final siren, no clear marker for all humanity to look at and say that everything changed from that point on. Some upheavals unfold so slowly that people believe they still have time, still have choices, still have a chance to make things right at some point in the future. But that very slowness becomes the most terrifying thing of all, because it allows an entire civilization to go on living as if nothing has changed, even as the ground beneath its feet is quietly disappearing and the ocean draws closer day by day. And when that hypothesis is pushed to its most extreme limit, the question stops being a simple thought experiment and becomes a doorway into the vision of a completely different Earth. What would happen if sea levels rose by another 100 meters? At first glance, that number sounds almost absurd. 100 meters does not feel like an environmental scenario. It feels like a post-apocalyptic story. It is so vast that the human mind struggles to picture it, because in ordinary life, just a few dozen centimeters of flooding is enough to paralyze a neighborhood, a city, even an entire economic region. But 100 meters is an entirely different scale. It is no longer about a few beaches being swallowed, a few cities building higher seawalls, or a few small islands vanishing from the map. 100 meters is enough to redraw the outlines of the continents, engulf most of the most densely populated deltas on Earth, break apart global infrastructure networks, and force humanity to abandon regions once seen as the cradle of trade, culture, and power. This would no longer be a weather event. It would be a total restructuring of civilization itself. For that scenario to happen, the world would have to pass through a chain of transformations stretching across many generations. Sea levels cannot rise by 100 meters in just a few years. That could only come from the massive melting of land-based ice sheets, especially Greenland and Antarctica, combined with the thermal expansion of the oceans as the planet warms over a very long period of time. In other words, this would not be a shock arriving overnight. It would be a slow-motion deluge, unfolding so gradually that many generations could be born and grow up within it without ever fully realizing that they were living through the remaking of the entire planet. That is exactly what makes the scenario even more dangerous. A disaster that comes too fast can trigger panic. A disaster that comes too slowly makes people delay, adapt in fragments, and reassure themselves that things have not yet reached the worst point. But with sea level rise, it is not only the water that is rising. What is rising is the debt of all civilization to nature. At first, nothing looks apocalyptic. The world simply begins to grow hotter. Summers become longer, ice melts earlier, king tides push farther inland, and storms hold water over the land for longer stretches. News headlines begin appearing more frequently with phrases that sound familiar: historic flooding, record salinity intrusion, unprecedented saltwater penetration, temperatures breaking every previous threshold. But in the early stages, most of humanity can still go on living. Coastal cities raise their seawalls, drainage systems are expanded, low-rise neighborhoods are reinforced. Many governments continue to believe this is merely an infrastructure management problem, a technological battle, a major challenge that still remains within the realm of control. People keep talking about adaptation as if enough money, enough engineers, and enough time will eventually make everything manageable. And yet, the real change begins when water stops being a seasonal threat and becomes a new, permanent condition of the world. When sea levels rise by the first few meters, the lowest lying regions immediately enter a period of fragility. Great deltas such as the Mekong, the Nile, coastal Bangladesh, the Netherlands, and the low island nations of the Pacific and Indian Oceans become the front line of the crisis. Farmland turns saline. Freshwater becomes less predictable. Regions that once fed tens of millions of people begin to lose productivity. A delta does not die on the first day saltwater enters it, but it begins to die from the roots upward, through the quiet exhaustion of soil, water, crops, and the belief that it can still sustain a long-term future. When sea levels continue rising by around 5 meters, many major coastal cities begin to lose the advantages that once made them wealthy. Miami, New Orleans, Bangkok, Jakarta, Shanghai, Alexandria, Venice, Ho Chi Minh City, and countless other urban centers do not necessarily sink all at once, but the cost of keeping them alive rises exponentially. Every storm becomes a test of endurance. Every major rainfall becomes a test for the entire defensive system. By the time sea levels rise around 10 meters, the crisis no longer belongs to the environment alone. It transforms into a political, social, and security crisis. Hundreds of millions of people living in low-lying regions begin to leave. At first, these are temporary movements. Then come large-scale resettlement plans. Eventually, they become waves of migration that cannot be reversed. At that point, the tension lies not only in the advancing water, but in the question of who will be saved first, who gets to live where, and who has the right to access higher land, clean water, food, and functioning infrastructure. Inland regions that once believed themselves safe suddenly become places forced to absorb immense population pressure. Housing prices surge. Power and water systems become overloaded. Schools, hospitals, and transportation networks strain to the limit. The clash between local residents and climate migrants becomes one of the century's greatest flashpoints, not because one side is better than the other, but because finite resources force people to look at each other through the lens of survival. When the sea rises by 20 meters, the map of the world begins to change so clearly that anyone can see it. Many delta regions across Asia are severely cut apart. Bangladesh is no longer able to retain anything close to its former shape. Many densely populated coastal strips in China, India, Europe, and North America are deeply eroded inland. Low-lying island nations steadily lose territory. Some small countries no longer exist in the traditional sense of a nation with land, borders, and stable settlement zones. From this point onward, a concept that once sounded like science fiction begins to emerge. Countries that still have governments, still have people, still have legal status, but no longer have a homeland in the old geographic sense. When a country must negotiate to buy land elsewhere in order to resettle its population, the international order begins to shake from its foundations. At around 30 meters, humanity begins to lose more than land. What the water swallows now is memory. Ancient cities, historic ports, temples, churches, plazas, places that once witnessed the birth and rise of urban civilization, slowly turn into ruins beneath the sea. The next generation will grow up with names like Venice, Alexandria, and many other famous coastal cities no longer as places to visit, but as underwater archaeological coordinates. This kind of loss carries a very different weight from losing houses or factories, because houses can be rebuilt and infrastructure can be recreated. But continuity with the past is far harder to restore. When a civilization loses the places that once held its memory, what is wounded is not only the map, but identity itself. Meanwhile, the global ecosystem also begins to warp in ways that are quieter, but no less cruel. Saltwater pushes into rivers, aquifers, and low coastal zones, altering freshwater structures across regions and continents. Many wetlands lose the ability to regulate themselves. Food chains in marine and coastal ecosystems are disrupted. Many species cannot adapt fast enough to the speed of environmental change. Fish alter their migration routes. Regions that once served as humanity's rice bowls, fishing grounds, and ecological buffers weaken all at once. From that point, the food crisis is no longer simply about insufficient production. It becomes the result of a cascading breakdown, in which land is salinized, weather grows more extreme, water sources become more erratic, and pests and disease are more likely to explode. In such a world, food is no longer just a commodity. It becomes a foundation of power. When sea level rise reaches 40 meters, a bitter truth becomes impossible to ignore. Humanity does not suffer a shared disaster in any fair or equal way. Wealthier nations try to buy time with technology, building massive seawalls, developing floating cities, shifting agriculture into greenhouses, investing in desalination plants, and relocating data, production, and administration centers to higher ground. Poorer nations, meanwhile, are forced to abandon land more quickly, lose the ability to adapt sooner, and pay a far heavier price for the same rising water. From this point on, equality is no longer merely about income or welfare. It becomes the difference between places that can still sustain life and places already erased from the future. The rich cannot stop the ocean, but they can buy a few more decades of stability. The poor usually do not have that privilege. When the sea reaches the 50-meter mark, many major coastal cities no longer have any chance of retaining their old structure. Some places try to hold on behind gigantic rings of protection, but that is only delay at an increasingly irrational cost. Financial, logistical, industrial, and cultural centers that once flourished because of their closeness to the sea are now forced by that same sea to retreat. Trade flows shift. Old ports disappear. Global transportation networks must be rebuilt. New centers of power rise deep inland, where the terrain is higher, fresh water is more stable, and land is more available to receive displaced populations. This is when humanity is forced to understand a truth that few previously wanted to believe. The ocean does not care how rich a city once was, how famous it was, or how many centuries it had existed. Water only cares about elevation. When the number climbs to 60 meters, the geography of the world is literally rewritten. Low-lying regions become new bays. New coastlines cut deep into the land. Peninsulas are split apart. Transportation routes that once crossed nations are severed or vanish entirely. Cities that once lay deep inland suddenly become new ports, while places that were once lively coastal hubs sink to the seafloor like a layer of history locked beneath the water. This is not just a change in scenery. When geography changes, every structure of power built on top of it changes as well. Trade, military strategy, energy, migration, culture, and tourism all have to be redefined. A child born into that world will learn a map completely different from the one their ancestors knew. And with that map comes a completely different understanding of what counts as the center, what counts as the edge, what is worth competing for, and what must be left behind. At 70 meters, population pressure on the remaining habitable land becomes suffocating. High, cool regions rich in freshwater become among the most valuable strategic assets on Earth. Conflict is no longer centered on oil or shipping lanes as it once was. Livable land becomes the thing that determines the future. Nations with broad highlands, relatively stable climates, and the ability to feed their people become the new fortresses of the world. By contrast, nations that have lost most of their deltas are forced to reorganize their populations through increasingly hard decisions. Values once treated as foundational, sovereignty, residency rights, human rights, international law, begin to be tested under conditions never seen before. Because when hundreds of millions need somewhere to live, every beautiful principle must pass through the brutal filter of reality. When sea levels rise to 80 meters, the water is no longer an approaching threat. It has become the fixed condition of human life. Economies that fail to adapt in time may collapse entirely. Occupations tied to the old world gradually disappear, while professions tied to the new world rise as the backbone of society, from water treatment, high-tech agriculture, and flood-resistant infrastructure design to population relocation, resource management, and architecture for unstable environments. Human psychology changes deeply as well. Home is no longer a fixed point on the map, but gradually becomes a memory carried in family stories. Children will grow up on high ground listening to grandparents describe an underwater city where the family once lived as if it were a lost continent. The painful part is that these stories are not myths. They have addresses, photographs, deeds, cemeteries, schools, and roads that once truly existed. As sea levels approach 90 meters, humanity can no longer deceive itself that this is a temporary phase. The world has taken on a new shape, and every government still functioning by that point is forced to admit that it is no longer governing countries as its ancestors once knew them. It is managing communities displaced again and again, infrastructures patched together continuously, survival economies, and societies in which the old meaning of stability has vanished. Inheritance is no longer a family home passed down through generations. Regional identity is no longer intact. Many foods disappear when the regions that produce their ingredients are submerged. Many traditional crafts die when the landscapes that gave birth to them no longer exist. Many accents, customs, and ways of life are severed from their cultural cradle by the sea. This loss is not violent like a tsunami, but it erodes civilization from within, hollowing out the very feeling of belonging. And then, when sea levels finally reach the 100-meter threshold, humanity looks back at the old map as if it were a memory of the planet. The most densely populated coastal belts in the world have been erased or distorted beyond recognition. Many megacities that define the 20th and 21st centuries lie deep underwater or survive only in their highest remnants as lonely islands. Great deltas that once fed agricultural civilization and then supported industrial civilization are largely consumed by the sea. The global distribution of population is transformed entirely. New centers of humanity move deep inland, up onto plateaus, into places that still preserve land, water, and room for long-term survival. At that point, the world no longer resembles the version humanity once knew. It is still Earth, but it is no longer the Earth that raised modern civilization. Yet the most frightening thing about the 100-meter mark is not the land that is lost in itself. The most frightening thing is everything that is dragged down with it. The global economy would be destroyed from the foundation upward. Coastal infrastructure, from deep water ports, power plants, industrial zones, cable routes, and data centers to roads, water systems, and billions of homes would either already be gone or would have to be rebuilt elsewhere at a cost unprecedented in human history. This would no longer be an economic crisis that markets could recover from after a few years. It would be the destruction of physical capital on a civilizational scale, where what is lost is not just money, but the physical base that makes money possible. World politics would not remain intact either. Some countries would no longer have their old capitals, their old borders, their old population densities, or their old social structures. Some would be forced into federalization, merger, or deep reorganization simply to survive. Some would erupt into isolationism because local populations would not want to share the remaining habitable land with endless waves of migrants. Some would have to invent entirely new legal models in which residency rights and access to resources become matters of survival no less important than citizenship itself. A world after 100 meters of sea level rise might not be one with fewer conflicts simply because everyone suffers together. On the contrary, it could very well be a world with more clashes, because when living space shrinks, every difference becomes sharper. But the deepest layer of consequences lies in human psychology. Human beings do not need only shelter, food, and water. They also need continuity with the past in order to feel whole. They need to know that the place where their parents were born is still there. They need a cemetery to return to, a street corner to remember, a piece of land they can call home without speaking of it in the past tense. When the water erases those landmarks, what disappears is not only material. What disappears is the continuation of collective memory. Hundreds of millions, even billions, may still survive in such a world. But survival does not mean remaining unscarred. A civilization uprooted from its own geography will go on living with a spiritual fracture that lasts across generations. The true climax of this story does not lie in the moment when the last city sinks or the last coastline is redrawn. It lies in the moment when humanity realizes that everything it once called control only had value within a narrow and fragile window of stability that nature happened to allow. For centuries, human beings built concrete, steel, ships, satellites, financial networks, and complex technical systems in order to believe they could manage every risk. But when the ocean rises by another 100 meters, the final lesson becomes unmistakable. Technology may help humanity go on living, but it is not powerful enough to preserve the old world once the foundational limits have been crossed. It cannot save the old map, keep the old homeland, restore the drowned deltas, or immediately heal societies already torn apart by migration, inequality, and loss. From there, humanity is placed before the greatest test it has ever faced. One path is to retreat inward, build barriers, divide, and fight over every remaining piece of habitable land. The other is to accept that no nation has ever defeated the ocean alone, and that long-term survival is possible only if the world learns to cooperate on an unprecedented scale, from sharing resources and redistributing populations to building new rules for a planet that has changed shape. The tragedy is that human beings often lean toward the second path, only after going far too deep into the first. In disasters that unfold slowly, mistakes rarely explode in front of the eye. They accumulate quietly, until the moment of reckoning reveals a cost far greater than what people once hoped to avoid. The end of the world in this scenario, then, would not necessarily be extinction, but it would almost certainly be the end of the world as we once knew it. In the darkest version, humanity survives, but in a civilization that has shrunk, fragmented, become brutally unequal, and lives permanently on the defensive, haunted by nostalgia for a lost planet. In a less dark version, human beings may still build new cities, create new centers, rewrite culture, economy, and political order according to the new shape of the earth. But even in that scenario, such a rebirth would not be gentle. It would be built on immense loss, on the memory of drowned lands, on displacement at an unprecedented scale, and on the bitter realization that many of these things did not have to go this far. And that is what makes the hypothesis of a 100-meter sea level rise more frightening than the number itself. It magnifies every weakness of modern civilization and forces us to see what is usually hidden by smaller numbers. The world does not need to wait for 100 meters before it begins to come apart piece by piece. Just a small fraction of that rise would already be enough to trigger migration, crop failure, conflict, salinization, infrastructure breakdown, and a crisis of memory on a vast scale. 100 meters is only a magnifying mirror, allowing humanity to see clearly that the entire stability it has grown used to was standing on a foundation of geography and climate far more fragile than it ever imagined. If sea levels really did rise by another 100 meters one day, humanity might still exist, but childhood coastlines, iconic cities, fertile deltas, vital trade routes, and ancestral lands would recede into the past like a civilization slowly swallowed by water. The world would not collapse with a bang. It would fade away in the sound of waves, in migrations stretched across generations, in maps drawn and redrawn, and in memories that no longer have a place to return to. The greatest question, then, does not lie in the 100-meter mark itself, but in the very long stretch of time before it arrives, the stretch of time in which humanity still has the chance to see the water approaching and decide whether it will continue to delay or act before an entire familiar world survives only in stories.